Christina went to the blue and white school. But to let you know, Christina had made this journal for Glenn, and Glenn kept, when he could remember, would write down dreams. But there's also something in here I need to share with you, and I'll get to that. But anyway, he had expressed to me one time that his children were was his greatest accomplishment. So he loved you. And those grands, oh my goodness, the grands. What a blessing. Thank you. Thank you. And Glenda, I'm a twinless twin. And Glenda, I know what it's like. God bless you. And just to give you a little more information, Glenn was born September the 4th. My father was born on September the 4th. His mother was born in June. My mother was born in June. We're both left-handed. Our twins, right-handed. He was born in Hammond, Louisiana, and I've actually been there. Not with him, way before I even knew him. So those are just some of the things we had in common, and of course, our love of our Savior. Christina, one thing he would share is about, you were in the back of the car, sitting, I guess, in a seat of, he gave you a piece of candy, even though Wendy said, don't give her any candy. And he panicked, of course, but you're still with us. And Jeremy told me about the story of the cat. The cat in the refrigerator, is that correct? Yeah, and Jeremy's like, so just a little something to share with you. Of course, his love of sports, love to talk about politics, go down to the Biscuitville, solve the problems of the world. And of course, I have to mention Skipper, our Jack Russell. Glenn brought Skipper home. Skipper was at the kill shelter. The gentleman convinced him to bring him home because with my work, I wasn't able to go by and see him. But I found him, and I said, "You go look at him." He did, and as I say, he brought him home. Did not return back to the shelter. And initially, it was my dog, Glenn would say. Then he would start saying, "You're my buddy. You're my buddy." And he would take him for RIDE. He loved taking Skipper for RIDE. So anyway, let me do this. Let me get in this book here. Glenda, this is for you. Now, this was written as a dream, and he wrote dreams January 2022, and this is what he dreamed. I was staying overnight with Glenda and Sonny, and she accused me of being an obnoxious house guest. I don't remember what I was doing, but, and he underlined that, I do remember that I agreed with her, was being obnoxious. So, and I'm just going to bring up a little something here. When the incident at Duke University emergency room happened with the gentleman and the, I guess, sheriffs or whoever they were. The prisoner had gotten one of their guns or whatever, but Glenn came home and he said to me, you know, the world was coming to an end. And he just kept saying to me, the world's coming to an end. You know, we're in the times where it's going to be soon. That's why I urge you to get right, But this is something Glenn wrote January the 4th of 2020. I have been thinking about the brevity of life. I am 69 years old. The Bible says 70. So my allotted time is close, and I feel like God has kept me alive because I was helping people in His kingdom. COVID, that bad five-letter word, has now changed everything to the point that I no longer feel sure that it's true. God has blessed my life with 2 wonderful children and 5 super grands. They are all I will leave behind. But I'm okay with that. God only knows what one or all of the grandkids may accomplish if COVID is controlled on America and or of all mankind. The world has gone crazy, and common sense is rare among people. I'm not sure I even want to know or see this world 10 to 15 years from now. That really scares me for my grandkids. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And again, if I say tar, thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I want to, you know what, there's one more thing. Jeremy, yeah, come on up. I do want to say, though, as he's coming up, I'm one of those people that he was talking about with his calling, and he meant a lot to me. I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment.
Hi. My name is Jeremy Cronrath. I am Glenn's son. Obviously, I've been thinking a lot about him over the last few days. And I wanted to share some things that stuck out to me with you. Some of them Sonny's already mentioned, but that's okay. But one of the main things that struck me, not so much about him, but just in general, is how even people who are closest to us, we still never know all the sides of them, which is, kind of one of the most obvious things you can say. But a little over a month ago, I received a text from my mother saying that my great-aunt's youngest child had passed away, and it included a link to Catherine's obituary, as well as a picture of her. I was embarrassed and confused because I didn't recognize the person in the photo, and I couldn't dredge up any memories of a family member named Catherine. But it all became clear when I clicked on the link and read the obituary that listed her full name. Her middle name was Renee, and I've known her as Renee my whole life, quite literally since before I could remember. I've always assumed her first name was Renee. We weren't that close, or I would have recognized her photo. It was more recent. I hadn't seen her in several years. So I didn't think I knew her the way you know a friend or a parent or a sibling. But I was shocked to learn that I didn't even know her name, who had been of this person who had been a part of my life since before I could remember. That text and learning so basic a fact as her name just drove home to me the idea that not only do we never really know everything about a person, but it can be really surprising the kind of basic things we don't know about the people who are close to us. With that in mind, I'd like to take this opportunity to relate some things about my dad. That you may or may not have had a chance to know in your time with him. First and foremost, he was a good father and eventually a loving grandfather. As an adult, I learned that he really wasn't enthusiastic about the idea of having children. My mom would phrase that differently. You never would have known that based on the way he treated us and the way he took care of us. When I was little, he would lay down in the bed with me every night at bedtime when I said my prayers and until I fell asleep. It was just time with Dad to talk and be comforted by his presence. A lot of times he'd fall asleep before me, and it kind of got on my nerves because he took up a lot of my bed. But he wanted me to know that he was there, and I didn't have to be afraid. When my parents split, not only did he not abandon my sister and I, he seemed determined to spend more time with us so that we would know he still loved us and was there for us. This can't have been easy because I at least was pretty resentful about the divorce, and I wasn't the easiest person to be around at that time. But Dad never let me push him away. He was jealous of his time with me and Christina, my sister. He must have known that someday we'd be thankful for that time. When Christina and I grew up and had families of our own, he cherished his grandkids and loved spending time with them. Most every time he visited, he'd bring some kind of gift for one or more of us. He always brought Cracker Jacks for Christina. I don't even know if she still likes Cracker Jacks, but she did when she was a kid. He'd bring boiled peanuts for me or baseball cards for the grandsons, or a book or a toy for any of the grandkids, or for that matter, for me or Christina, that he might have found in a thrift shop or an antique store. He'd take the grandkids, usually one at a time, so they had special time with Grandpa, or G-Pa, as I like to call him, to lunch at a Chinese restaurant or baseball game. Any baseball game would do. It didn't matter to him who was playing, if he'd ever heard of a single person on the team. It was all about spending time with the grandkids and watching baseball. One thing I'm sure you did know was that he was a talker. He'd strike up a conversation with anyone, anywhere. It didn't matter if he knew them. He'd notice from their shirt they liked a baseball team, or from a sticker on their car he'd visited somewhere he'd been or wanted to visit, wind up having a 10 or 15 minute conversation with a total stranger. What you may not know, or you may since he did it so often, is that it wasn't uncommon for me or Christina to come up during these conversations with strangers. Dad carried one of my business cards in his wallet. He showed it off so much that a few times he'd have to ask for a new one to replace the old one that had been worn out from taking it out and putting it back in his wallet so many times. I work for a company that most likely none of you have ever heard of outside of maybe my dad showing you my card. And I work in a capacity that I don't usually have much reason to talk about my work with other people. It's not secret, just kind of boring. Even my wife can handle hearing it only in small doses. But Dad would show my card and talk about me. And if there was a potato chip bag handy, he'd check it for my company's logo to show the person This is something that my son's company made. Didn't matter that I had no connection to that side of the business. So yeah, he was a family man. That's probably not a shock to most of you. Something you might not have known is that he loved his family in quieter ways too. Earlier this week, my mother and Christina and I had lunch with our Aunt Glenda, Dad's twin sister, and her husband Sonny, who was probably Dad's best friend over the last 10 years, except maybe Skipper. The lunch was in preparation for this service and just to spend some time together as family and remember Dad. And they talked about how he visited and called my grandmother most every day after Papa passed away. Dad just wanted to check on her and make sure she was okay and not too lonely because she lived alone after Papa died. They told me how he checked on his cousin Jeff after his mother's passing, my Aunt Joy. And he'd visit frequently, despite the fact that he lived several hours away in South Carolina. And his many visits to check on his older brother Cleet after his cancer diagnosis. And I was embarrassed that I didn't know any of that. He didn't make a big deal about it. He just wanted to be there for his family when they needed him. Doing so was its own reward because he loved them. Another thing I learned at that lunch, and Uncle Sonny shared it with you, he was the one who mentioned it, was that he apparently had a keen interest in Vladimir Putin and had in fact read several books on that subject. And that made me think of his interest in the world and current events. And I don't mind sharing with you that I didn't agree with a lot of his ideas and opinions in that area. Despite that, and based on a lot of conversations we had over the last several years, I've come to realize that Dad was the type of person who constantly examined his views. He was more of a thinker than I often gave him credit for. Several times I heard him express doubts about some issue of the day, even the side that he found himself on. But he'd try to examine that issue from all sides and decide that the only choice his conscience would allow him to make was what he saw as the lesser of two evils. I found that in many, if not most cases, I'd examine the same information and come down on the opposite side of the issue. But because of how he fairly examined his views and respected mine, we never found any topic we couldn't discuss, disagree on, and then go to lunch or talk about whoever's birthday was coming up next. Dad didn't enjoy math as much as he did history. I always found math to be more in line with my way of thinking. It seems simpler to me than writing or history. In math, there's pretty much always one right answer. But in the areas that Dad loved, you could have people with completely opposite views, and they were all valid, or some might even say correct. That just doesn't make sense to me. I find the logic in math and a certain amount of rigidity to be comforting, but Dad preferred the freedom that history and world politics allows a person in terms of choosing what view makes sense to them. I find that confusing and frustrating. Despite all that, I always remember that it was my father, not my mother, who was a math teacher for her entire professional career and who still tutors high school students in math today. It was Dad who taught me to do percents and multiplication in my head. He would break down whatever problem he wanted to solve into manageable pieces. He'd solve the pieces and combine them back into the larger problem, and he always got the right answer. It was simple and elegant, and I still use this method almost every day of my life in one way or another, often without realizing it. I can't tell you how many people throughout my life have mentioned this ability to do math in my head, and it reminds me of him every time. I hope I've succeeded in passing that ability to take large problems and break them down and solve them to my daughter. Another thing you may not have known about Dad was that he enjoyed some less common foods. I know that wasn't a hugely important piece of who he was, but food is such a fundamental part of life. We all have to eat. That I really can't think of him or almost anyone who's been a really important part of my life without some type of food association, whether it's a dish that person loved or cooked for me, or a meal we shared together, or a family event that we had, a party or something. Anyway, when I think of Dad, I remember some of the foods he introduced me to, and some of the things he liked to eat. He loved plenty of common or normal things: fried chicken, Chinese takeout, food from Mexican restaurants, and Thanksgiving feasts with all the trimmings, and on and on. But what I remember him for are the slightly more exotic food items he enjoyed. Dad introduced me to marshmallow fluff as a food, and more importantly, fluffernutter as a type of sandwich. If you've never heard of fluffernutter, it's just like PB&J, but instead of the jelly, you spread marshmallow fluff on the side of the sandwich that doesn't have peanut butter on it. And if you've never had one, do yourself a favor. Dad also got me to try kippered herring. I couldn't even tell you what that is beyond some type of fish, small fish in a can. I don't think it's the same thing as sardines, but I honestly couldn't tell you. But they're not too bad on a saltine cracker. He enjoyed pork rinds and boiled peanuts, both of which I picked up from him. Despite his love of all these less popular foods, he was more than happy to have a snack of a simple slice of white bread, preferably Sunbeam or Wonder. And if there happened to be a pack of hot dogs in the fridge, he'd grab one and start eating. No need to heat it. And he was right. White bread makes a fine snack. And for a large part of my childhood, I preferred hot dogs straight from the fridge over those straight from the grill. Dad also ate some things I never could get behind. I never saw the appeal of beanie weenies or fatback. He liked fried bologna and fried Spam, either of which I view as an excellent inducement to skip a meal. And I don't skip many meals. And I don't think I'll ever understand what the purpose of chow chow could possibly be. Nevertheless, even before he passed, the sight of any one of those immediately brought him to mind. I can't tell you how many times we've been in a farmer's market or some type of, maybe a country gas station. I see a jar of chow chow, and my wife knows before I open my mouth, I'm going to point it out and say it reminds me of Dad. Oh yeah, Dad's whole family seemed to love this mustard mayonnaise sauce. We never had a meal on his side of the family without a bowl of it ready on the table. Even I like that one. But since it's just mustard and mayonnaise mixed together in a bowl, I never have understood why you'd bother making it, as opposed to just having a jar of each one on the table and letting each person use as much as they want. Dad attended rock concerts when he was younger. He saw the Rolling Stones and Blue Oyster Cult, maybe some others I never knew about. I'm pretty sure I smelled marijuana for the first time at a Chicago concert he took me to, where Three Dog Night was the opening act. I can't be sure, I was too young to recognize the smell, and the crowd was at an age where they may have been using it more for cataracts than pleasure. But that was an experience I don't think I'll forget. Dad loved to go to the movies when I was younger. There was a dollar theater called the Cardinal just around the corner from our house, and it seemed like we were there most every week. He never seemed to mind spending $1 for me to enjoy the movie and $1 for him to have a nice nap. I'm sure I could tell you many more things about my father that you may not have known, and I imagine there are quite a few things I could learn about him from you. At the end of the day, what I'll remember most about him, and what I hope you've gotten from my words here today, is that he was my dad. He loved me. And I love him. Thank you all for being here
to help us through this day. And hopefully to share some good memories so we can get through it together.
Thank you, Jeremy. Glenn was a true brother in Christ to me. And Carolyn asked me to prepare a song, and I want to set it up just by telling you a couple of things that you may not know about me and Glenn. Our friendship predated me coming on as music director here in Pinehurst. We were singing together in the choir at First Baptist Church in Fayetteville. And we were just great friends right off the bat. Well, one day he was gone. He had got married and moved to Pinehurst and found himself a new church. And I had no idea at that point that I would end up here. But when I did, it was one of the first people that I saw. It was Glenn. And he made me feel right at home. Just a wonderful thing. Singing in the choir. We ended up in Sunday school together, Bible study on Sunday evening, senior trips. We traveled all over the state and experienced some of the great things that North Carolina has to offer. We talked sports. One of the things we also talked that you might not know about him was opera. He was a real opera buff. He would go to the theater here in Southern Pines and watch Live from the Met in New York City. Most importantly, he paved the way. He helped. He was one of the many that did, but he helped pave the way for my transition into full-time ministry. And I got to know Sonny and Glenda as a result of Glenn. Pastor David encouraged me to go to Southeastern and get a degree there. And it's a hard degree to get, but what made it so much easier was having somewhere to stay on a particular late night when class didn't end until 9:30, or I'd have to be there for an entire week to take a course. And they opened their home to me, and it was my second home at the time while I was pursuing the degree for ministry. Finally, several of you here, in fact, were part of a committee that helped me during my ordination into ministry. And Glenn and Carolyn both were on that committee. Carolyn Cronrath and Carolyn Sutton, who's sitting over here, were on that as well, and probably somebody else that I've forgotten. But Pastor David was there and shared a message on that day. And they gave me a gift. I'm wearing that gift today. It's kind of like this piano right here. It's a tie, but it has a brown grand piano on it. And so Glenn made his mark. He made his mark in my life in a wonderful way that lasts for my lifetime. And in giving me a tie that I can wear and remember him by. And this song is a new one for me. It's called Scars in Heaven. And I've thought a lot about Glenn as I've been singing the song the last couple of days, and I hope you will too. But more importantly, on who the subject of the song is. That's Jesus. If I had only known the last time would be the last time, I would have put off all the things I had to do. I would have stayed a little longer, held on a little tighter. Now what I'd give for one more day with you. 'Cause there's a wound here in my heart where something's missing. And they tell me that it's gonna heal with time. But I know you're in a place where all your wounds have been erased, And knowing yours are healed is healing mine. The only scars in heaven, they won't belong to me and you. There'll be no such thing as broken, and all the old will be made new. And the thought that makes me smile now, even as the tears fall down, is that the only scars in heaven are on the hands that hold you now. I know the road you walked was anything but easy. You picked up your shares of scars along the way. Oh, but now you're standing in the sun. You fought the fight and your race is won. The pain is all 1,000,000 miles away. The only scars in heaven, they won't belong to me and you. There'll be no such thing as broken, and all the old will be made new. And the thought that makes me smile now, even as the tears fall down, is that the only scars in heaven are on the hands that hold you now. For the hands that hold you now. There's not a day goes by that I don't see you. You live on in all the better parts of me, until I'm standing with you in the sun. I'll fight this fight, in this race I'll run, until I finally see what you can see. Oh, the only scars in heaven, they won't belong to me and you. There'll be no such thing as broken, and all the old will be made new. And the thought that makes me smile now, even as the tears fall down, is that the only scars in heaven are on the hands that hold you now.
As I was sitting there for a few minutes and listening to these who have come and spoken, I was realizing that there's not really anything that I can add to what has been said. Carolyn's done a great job, Sonny did a great job, and his son did a great job. And how do you follow the brother-in-law, the wife, and the son? I want to kind of streamline what I was planning on saying, though. I'll tell you kind of an outline of what the Lord had laid on my heart, and think you'll be able to just grasp from the outline of what I wanted to share today. I had chosen a passage that probably is not a passage that is chosen very much for a memorial service. I'd chosen the 16th chapter of the book of Romans. And those of you that are familiar with that will realize that that's the last chapter of the book of Romans. And what Paul has done here is he has written to a church, and a church that he had never had the opportunity to go to yet, but that his plan was to go to the church in Rome. And in fact, that's a part of what the letter was about, that's his sharing his desire to go to the church in Rome and to be there with them. And he shares that with them, and he lays out the plan of salvation. And then at the end of the letter, he begins to share his greetings with a number of the people that he knew were a part of the Church of Rome. Even though he had not been there, he had come to know the fact that there were a number of people that he knew were a part of that church in Rome. And he begins to say, I want to send my greetings to, and he names a number of people throughout those last few verses. And several of them, he says, and please tell my dear friend. And he names those friends. If you look back, you can read it for yourself later on sometime. Now, Paul was one that loved everyone, and he loved everyone within the church. Even he loved those who he had not yet met because he hadn't even had the opportunity to get to the church in Rome. But there were some that he called dear friends. And there would be some people that would say, well, pastors ought not to play favorites. They should treat everybody the same. They ought to love everybody. And quite honestly, we do. I can remember when I had the privilege of being the pastor of this church, and I loved everybody that God brought into the life of this church. I was excited when an individual would come or a family would come, and I was excited to see them come, and I loved them. But to be quite honest, there are just a few people that you really find that you have some real common ground with, and you have some likenesses with, and they get to be close friends of yours. And that's what's happened with Paul. Paul says, these are some dear friends of mine, and he calls them by name, and he says, please greet them. One of the things that I remembered about Glenn was that when they came, he and Carolyn started coming, that it really wasn't very long before I realized that Glenn and I had a lot in common. And because of those common things that we liked, a friendship grew out of that, and that I considered to be Glenn really a good friend. We both liked the game of golf. I noticed this up here that has the golf and the golf club and the golf balls in there. It's a beautiful arrangement. I may have been with Glenn when he bent that club that's been up in there. One of the things that I found is the fact that Glenn's golf game and my golf game were very similar. Neither one of us were going to shoot in the 70s, but neither one of us is just going to beat it around the course either. And so we had a common kind of a game there that we enjoyed, and we had the opportunity to play golf together a number of times, and I always enjoyed that. We love sports, and it's been mentioned already, I could talk about our love of sports for a number of minutes, but we found out that we both really enjoyed sports, and we both really loved baseball. I can't count the number of times that Glenn and I would find ourselves at the same baseball game. We would go to the Pinecrest High School baseball games, and we would sit together and we would watch the games, and we would enjoy baseball together, and we enjoyed those times. We enjoyed a number of other sports that he liked and that I liked. We both loved the University of North Carolina Tar Heels. I wore this tie today just in honor of him. And I found it always a thing that he would text me. And I found out later, or just this week, that he had a number of texting buddies. I didn't realize he was texting so many different people, but whenever the Tar Heels were playing, I would get a text from Glenn. Whether it was football or basketball or baseball, he was texting me, and he was talking about how the Tar Heels were doing, whether they were going to win or lose, and we would text back and forth. We had a number of things in common. And because of that commonality, Glenn and I got to be what I would consider dear friends. Paul, here in this last chapter of the book to the church in Rome, mentioned a number of dear friends of his. I remember not too long ago, just a few days ago, Glenn texted me, and to quote him, he said, "Are you ready to unretire?" And I texted him back really quickly and told him, no, I wasn't ready to unretire. But we had the kind of friendship that we could joke with one another, and we just enjoyed being with one another. He was a great friend. Paul understood that. You see, being a pastor of a church is really a great blessing. But quite honestly, there are a few times when it's a heavy burden. And it's good to have good friends when you go through some of those burdensome times. And Glenn was one of those kind of friends. I'm thankful for that. There's another parallel that runs in the 16th chapter of the book of Romans that kind of runs parallel with Glenn. Not only our friendship together, and it's been mentioned, if you read through that chapter later on, you'll see that Paul mentions a number of his friends and the work that they did in the church. He mentions Priscilla and Aquila, and he sends them his greetings. And we know that Priscilla and Aquila worked with Paul on several of his missionary journeys, that Priscilla and Aquila worked in the church in Corinth, in Ephesus, and in Rome. He mentions one by the name of Epaenetus. He mentions Mary, who he says worked hard for you. He mentions Urbanus. He says he is a co-worker with me. Tryphena and Tryphosa, he said, are women who worked hard in the Lord. And he mentions Persis, who is another woman who worked hard in the Lord. You see the parallel of how that runs with Glenn's life? It's been shared. He was a worker in the church. He did a number of things. He taught Sunday school. He sang in the choir. He went on mission trips. He served as a chaperone for our youth. He went on our men's retreat. He worked on our kitchen committee. On and on. And not just in this church. I didn't realize it until Jesse was telling the story a number of years ago to me that he knew Glenn before they came here, that at Village Baptist Church, and the number of hours that he was involved in the work of the church. Paul's friends, that's how he got to know them, was through their work in the church. And Glenn was one of those. He was one who worked in the life of the church. The third parallel that I want to share with you that runs in this chapter and runs with the life of Glenn. Throughout the chapter, Paul says, greet this person, greet this person, greet this person. And understand it carries with it more than what we have in our mind today, but in New Testament times it's really talking about give this person the peace of God, the joy of Christ. Tell them that I am bestowing upon them my desire, that the peace of God is in their lives. That's what Paul was saying here. And then he kind of ends the part and he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. You know what I think is transpiring right now with Glenn? Is that he is doing that. He is greeting one another with a holy kiss. All of those great characters that we've studied in God's Word, that Glenn had studied, he had taught about. Great men of Moses and Abraham and David and Elijah and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Peter and James and John and Paul, the writer of this letter. He is meeting and he is greeting them with a holy kiss as we are sitting right here today. He is doing that. That is a parallel that is running through this chapter that is taking place in the life of Glenn right now. You see, I believe that he is in heaven. Jesus told his disciples when he got ready to leave, I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms, many mansions. If it weren't so, I would tell you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, then I'm going to come and receive you to myself, so that where I am, you can be also. You see, I think Glenn is right there. And he's spending these days, and he's going to be spending the next eternal time in heaven, greeting and meeting and giving a holy kiss to these great ones. Last Monday night, the North Carolina Tar Heels were playing, I think, Virginia Tech. And sure enough, Glenn starts texting me. And we were texting back and forth in the game, and the Tar Heels had started out pretty good and had a lead. And he says, looks like another win. Well, after a while, they fall behind, and he says, I don't know if they're going to win or not. And I was grieving along with him about that as we were texting back and forth. And then finally, the Tar Heels managed to get ahead, and as the minutes wound down, it looked like it was going to be another win at home for the Tar Heels. And that's what he texted me. You know what the last 3 words that he texted me? The last 3 words that I'm going to have on my phone from Glenn was, home sweet home. As I thought about that, I thought, I know that he was in his conscious mind thinking about the ding dong. But maybe in the recesses of his spiritual heart, he was realizing that he was drawing near to that eternal home, sweet home. You see, it was that night that he went to sleep and woke up in that heavenly home that Christ has prepared for those of us who are followers of his.